course, over 230 years of occupation, not yet ceded their territory to either the state of Victoria or the University of Melbourne. And our relationship with the Wurundjeri Land Council is an incredibly important part of the work that we do in the Indigenous Settler Relations collaboration. So I'd like to ask everyone to take a little bit of time today to reflect on what it means to be able to work and study on this campus. And what kinds of responsibilities flow from that. I'd also like to thank Rachel Fensham and Tom of the Digital Studio, who we're working in partnership to bring this series to life. We're thrilled to have such an outstanding lineup of speakers over the semester, and equally thrilled to have had so much interest from across campus and all of your wonderful participation in this conversation and those who are tuning in online. Luke and I are going to have a little bit of a conversation, have a little bit of a yarn, over the next 30 or 40 minutes. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions and contributions, and I think we're both pretty relaxed enough that if people just want to chuck their hand up while we're talking and interrupt and to disrupt, please feel welcome to do so. So it's not going to be a formal presentation today. I'm going to let Luke introduce himself.
Sure.
And to also introduce a bit of background and history to what IndigenousX is.
Fair enough. I'm Luke. Luke Pearson, Gamilaroi man. Sort of lived all around New South Wales in my time. So dad from Walgett, born in Sydney, grew up in Wagga, university up in Newcastle, did a primary teaching Aboriginal Studies degree, taught for 3 years, which, yeah, less time it took me to get the bloody degree. But one thing sort of, I was naive and young enough to sort of believe the stuff I learned at university about the importance of Aboriginal education in the New South Wales Department of Education and the anti-racism policy and the Aboriginal education policy. And so when I called out racism, I very quickly learned that that is not welcome or encouraged, especially not in your first few years of teaching. And so butted heads with the principal one too many times. And then found myself a teacher who realised I wasn't going to teach. And that's the sort of degree that you do not as a stepping stone to anything else. Like you do a teaching degree because you want to teach. And then we're like, look, I'm not going to teach. So you can bleep that out, Tom. You sort of go, what are you going to do? And so, dad was always sort of manual labour. Mum worked in docks and JJs. And dad as a kid was in docks and JJs. So I had no interest in working in that space because it is horrible. And so I had no idea what I was going to do or where I was going to go. And then Twitter became a thing. And so I jumped on Twitter as something to do and really loved that space in the early days. After a few years, it, for a whole bunch of different reasons, sort of led me to the creation of IndigenousX, which I'd assume most of you follow IndigenousX or have some knowledge of IndigenousX, or else good on you for taking the leap to come in here. Yeah, if not, you can. We have a Patreon. You can. So yeah, it came up with that idea, one, to sort of, I guess now we're talking about disruption, to sort of disrupt the mainstream sort of narratives about Indigenous people as told through non-Indigenous lenses. So it was a very simple idea where I gave up my personal account, rebranded it IndigenousX, different Indigenous person each week, take the account, do whatever you want. And it was really as simple as that, with that sort of broader philosophy of, people are the experts on their own lives and have their own stories to tell, and we don't need non-Indigenous media to tell our stories, especially not when they do it horribly, and always have. And there's been a long-standing assumption that people don't want to hear from Indigenous people. They want to hear about Indigenous people, but only in particular stories told in particular ways through a particular lens. And so I didn't think that was true. And when we created IndigenousX, a lot of people just sort of instantly got the philosophy of what we were trying to do. And this was very much the early days of Twitter. So we're 7 years old. IndigenousX turned 7 in March. Didn't know how long it was going to go or where it was going to go or what we were doing. It was just have a crack and try something new. So there weren't rotation accounts back then. It wasn't a thing. There's a lot of them now, which is really awesome, but a lot of them will tell you they exist because of IndigenousX. Then after we'd been around maybe a couple of years, The Guardian came over to Australia and they reached out and sort of sent me a message and like, oh, you know, we're doing a Guardian Australia thing. Love to come in and have a yarn. And I thought the Europe Guardian were just doing like an Australian edition of a thing. I didn't realise there was going to be a Guardian Australia. So I went in to be interviewed, and they offered me a partnership and basically said like they were really worried about coming out to Australia. Knew they were going to get attacked by the Australian and that sort of media about like, you don't know Australia, and they wanted to do Indigenous stuff well, but knew they didn't know how to do it. And so we came up with the idea of letting each host write an article, and overnight the Guardian became the publication in Australia that published the most Indigenous people, because they were publishing one Indigenous person a week, and that was enough to instantly become the top place in Australia for publishing diverse. If you remember before then, like, I mean, we're doing a hell of a lot better now across the board, but at the time there were like 4 or 5 people who could actually write an op-ed, like, and they were all in the Australian. And it was Noel and Warren and Marcia and, you know, a handful of others. And so, yeah, we helped sort of challenge that idea that people didn't want to hear from Indigenous people. And then, yeah, like I said, at the time, you didn't do stuff on Twitter to do anything. You just did it because it was something to do. And 7 years later, we still exist, which I think is our #1 achievement. We haven't disappeared from the space. You know, a whole range of different people that you would have heard of, people that you've never heard of. You know, I assume there's 3 or 4 people in the room who've been IndigenousX, which is always nice when I rock up.
Who here has hosted IndigenousX?
There you go. 4. I was right. Nailed it.
Well done.
I see a few other mob who I will be signing you up before I leave.
Anyone? I should have asked this at the beginning. Does anyone here not follow IndigenousX? Oh, okay.
There's
Give it a follow. Is that because you're not on Twitter? Yeah. Okay. So I want to take a step back and just ask you initially what it was. What did you make of Twitter when you first came to it as an individual that made it feel like it was an exciting site of possibility? And when was the moment where you thought there's something here for something like IndigenousX and decided to change your account over in that way?
Well, my experience with social media before then had very much been that Facebook model of you follow the people you went to school with and the people that you're mates with. And so to have a space where you found people through shared interests and kindred spirits, and you know, it was just really, you know, exciting at that time. And for me, very much as, you know, a teacher without a classroom, I had a lot of stuff that I wanted to share and a lot of anger and frustration about my experience with education. And so I just loved it. I spent way more time than I would recommend any human being ever spend on Twitter. So I was there day in, day out. Like, I was, you know, young, single, angry, doing a bit of freelance work. I kept a bloody swag in the boot and drove around doing work where I could. And so I had that energy to burn and I didn't need much. So I just...
And those experiences that you were sharing on Twitter as an individual, you felt a resonance across Twitter. Yeah. So that signal, I guess, of an appetite.
There was interest in it. It was very validating and very gratifying. And over time, and I guess the negative side of what inspired me to create IndigenousX was, you know, like, you start getting asked to write an article or do a radio interview or whatever, and like, it was like, oh, people want to hear, you know, people like what I'm saying and it's resonating with people and people think my voice matters. And then I sort of came to realize that most of the journos who were involved just didn't know any Aboriginal people. And we're like, oh, we'll get Luke to talk about that because I don't know anyone. And so it was one day I got asked to comment on Aboriginal women's experiences of living on the basics card in the Northern Territory, that sort of made me stop and go, maybe it's not because of me as an individual, but it's just because I'm visible and accessible and I'm comfortable talking on stage, I'm comfortable writing, I'm comfortable on camera, comfortable on mic. So yeah, I was media friendly in that broader sense. And so that was quite disheartening and sort of led me to that realization as well. Like, a lot of what I would talk about was the need for diverse voices. And there's only so much you can ever do as an individual to showcase that, because it's still always just my voice and my opinions, even though I'm talking about the need for diverse voices. And so it was a bit of a conundrum of like, I love this platform. I love the audience. I love the potential for what it has, but I don't want to be that fellow where now I'm the sixth person who's allowed to have a voice. So that was really challenging for a while with working out what to do with that. So, I tried giving my account away to just different individuals for a while, and that wasn't working, and sort of pulled back for a bit and didn't know what to do. And then I had the idea for IndigenousX and created the account. But I sat on it for 6 months, sort of not knowing what to do. And then one day just jumped in the deep end. It was that NCIE thing. I think, Todd, probably you would have been there that day, would you? There was like an Indigenous youth thing at the time.
So NCIE is the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence, based up in Redfern in Sydney.
Yep. Yeah. And so, it was just a bunch of young ones who were doing cool stuff. And I sort of leapt up and said, all right, I'm doing it. Sent around a bit of paper. Put your name down if you want to have a crack. Got a dozen names and jumped in. Like I said, not knowing where it'd go or how long it'd go for, but so there was that love of Twitter and that space, but also that frustration of not wanting to become that person who's seen as a spokesperson. Which sadly, anytime any of us speak in a public space, you are seen as a spokesperson, even if you aggressively say you are not.
Yeah.
You just know that you are. That's how you will be framed by a lot of people.
And being asked to represent hundreds of nations and peoples and experiences across the world, across the country. So do you know how many hosts you've had over the last 7 years?
Oh, well, 52 a year for 7 years. So,
but
we've had a lot of double ups as well.
Repeats.
So, you've had, there'd be a small crew of us who've done it half a dozen times. Each, and a lot of the time that's out of necessity. Someone calls up Thursday night and says, I can't do next week. Yeah. And so then it's like, who can I get who will jump in with absolutely zero notice?
And many of those, one of the things that strikes me about IndigenousX is that it is a truly diverse spectrum of students, professionals, academics, eminent public figures, from all walks of life. And it has contributed a really rich diversity to and plurality, I guess, of different kinds of perspectives that Indigenous people bring. So there is not IndigenousX doesn't offer a continuity so much of politics or ideology or even values, really. People all bring their own positions to them. And that seems like a really rich contribution that mainstream media struggles with a little bit more.
Yeah, well, it's that need for them to have that level of control and that editorial process and policy that they have. And so, to have regular voices in mainstream media, they either have to be interviewed from a non-Indigenous person or, it always goes through that lens. So unless they're actually employing Indigenous people, but even then, most Indigenous people working in media will have a non-Indigenous editor or producer or whatever. So it's very hard to have that space where you can just kind of do what you want to do.
Yeah. And so where do you think IndigenousX sits in relation to other Indigenous-led news organisations? I'm thinking of NITV. I'm thinking of Indigenous community radios across the country. How do you understand, I guess, the Twitter and digital platforms sitting alongside those organisations?
Yeah. I think one of the key differences for us is that we are broke as hell.
This is why everyone should check out the Patreon link.
Yeah. I worked at NITV for a couple of years and loved my time there. I was the senior digital producer, so wrote a lot of articles and commissioned a lot. So you had the news team and you had the digital team, and sort of everything that went through digital I had a hand in one way or another for that period of time. And it was great and it was exciting. And they are crazily underfunded. So when I say they have resources, like NITV is crazy broke for what they actually achieve. But like NITV still with a number of in-house writers and a number of sort of avenues and platforms can just has the capacity to just tell news. Like, here's a thing that happened. We don't. Like, for 6 years it was just me. Now it's me and one other fella, and a lot of volunteers and a lot of people who give up their time to host or to write articles or whatever it may be. But we don't have the luxury of really breaking news or just covering that sort of journalistic stuff. So we have to come at things quite differently. We have to be a bit opportunistic. We have to be a bit flexible. So we try to position ourselves as, like if there is something in the news that we'll talk about the pattern of behaviour that we're seeing rather than the individual act that's happened. So, because when you're reporting, particularly on racism, like it's always the same freaking thing in different forms of different people, and but so we try to have that higher conversation about what's happening, and sort of that like I said, it's like we, as new terms for cool things come up, oh, you're a form of digital disruption. I was like, fucking okay, that's fine. We can be that. But we just we do the best we can with what we have.
And so I think that's one of the really interesting things about the digital platform, not just Twitter, but social media generally. But I think we see this most acutely with Twitter, which is that it is this really powerful platform for digital disruption. You have, through IndigenousX, been able to produce a huge array of Indigenous voices, of introducing a disruptive quality to the way that mainstream news reports Indigenous issues, to create new platforms for Indigenous Australians to participate in nationwide public conversations about issues that they're passionate about and that affect them. And it is also a platform not designed to make money.
I'm trying to now. I'm giving it a crack. I've got kids now. I'm trying. I'm not trying to be broke.
I'm not push you to a conversation you don't want to have.
But we are. It's not a business that I started to have a business. So it's not something that I aspire to have, that whatever it may be. I want to bring on more staff because I want to do more stuff.
Yeah.
Not because I want to make more money.
Yeah. I think you should make more money. No, but I guess the point I'm coming to, and maybe others in the room who are more engaged with news and journalism and media might have some questions and comments to make, is that it's the very capacity to be this disruptive force through a platform like Twitter also seems to be related to the kind of limitations to be able to build a new business model around it. And of course, my understanding in news media and journalism that these are industries that have also been disrupted by digital platforms in different ways that have changed the kinds of funding models and business models for producing journalism around the world. So how, what would you like to see come from that? What would it take to make IndigenousX a viable, vibrant, valued media organisation in Australia?
I think we're on path to do that now. So James, who, like I said, came on board last year, has more of a traditional comms media background, has run his own business and consultancies over the years. I've been freelancing for a long time. So we're trying to find that right balance between doing fee-for-service work and then funding the media arm out of that. Patreon has been an absolute godsend for us. So it helps a lot with becoming that sustainable thing. So, for a very long time, like I said, in the early days, it cost very little. It just took a lot of time. And so
time is money.
And time is money. But when you're a single fellow who's freelance and you can do that, that was fine. Now, like 3 kids, partner, it's just a very different reality now. And I am at a stage of life, having done what I've done for so long, and sort of like it took me a long time to be okay with saying, it's like, no, I actually want to make a living. I'd like to be paying some super. I'd like to have health insurance, which I still don't have, but I'd love to have that one day. Those sort of things. It took me a long time to say, okay, we actually need some strategy around what we're doing, and we need to have a plan and a level of growth. But for me, I'd be really happy. IndigenousX with 4 or 5 staff, I think, is as big as I probably ever need it to be.
One of the ways I'm seeing and I guess this is because I'm an academic, and is the suite of resources that suddenly IndigenousX has cumulatively produced in terms of Indigenous authored, Indigenous-led content, much of which is on subjects and issues that are not being produced in mainstream media. And so these are very material, valuable resources that teachers, across the country in schools and universities turn to be able to broaden out what they're able to speak about and teach about. And yet those same institutions are also the institutions that, I mean, it just seems to me that there is a cumulative sort of space around IndigenousX of underfunded, under-resourced institutions.
No, I spent years, like the first few years, I just naturally assumed, like, we're doing stuff that people get funded a lot of money to do, and we're doing it better for free. So I just naturally assumed one day someone would turn up and go, here's money, like, keep doing what you're doing. But like, and that's not a thing, like that doesn't exist. But I had no idea of how that worked. And trying to work out, like, and I was part of that group in the early days of like, how the hell do you turn Twitter or an online, like a blog or an online platform, like how do you make money out of this? And even like now, like we sell ad space, but we don't sell a lot of ad space. And when we do, it's always specific, generally federal government, Indigenous specific campaigns. Where it's like, so, people like Kmart aren't wanting to advertise on, and I'm like, but why not? Like we've got an audience who buy stuff, who live in the world. And not that I'm saying I necessarily want Kmart as an advertiser, but you know what I mean? Like I don't not want them. I just like, we have ad space sitting there that could make money that I could use to buy more articles with. So I would love it to be full, but you're just trying to work out that, like, how do you make money in a space where you're competing against media that will happily burn money because they have that money behind them. So, like when you've got the Rupert Murdochs and the whoever's, like they don't need to make money. We at least need to make enough money to pay for content and to pay staff and to pay the people that we pay. And it's been a very slow journey. And even stuff like that, like, speaking of the universities and for all the people working in universities here, it's like they use our articles en masse like crazy. And a lot of their academics will write for us and they will, yay, we had an academic write for IndigenousX. But it's like, they're not putting their ads for their scholarships on. It's like, like when we come to unis and they're like, how can we help IndigenousX? I'm like, you can give us money. And they're like, well, we don't want to give you money. And I'm like, you can buy ad space. Like you are giving that ad space to the Australian people who hate you and want to corrupt what you're doing. And a lot of Indigenous orgs too, like, we've got a 2-page ad coming up in the Australian. And I'm like, why would you do that? Like, and so it has been really frustrating on that level, but I've gotten to a point now where we're just like, okay, it is what it is. And what do we do? And so, trying to get those little runs on the board to show that we can do stuff. So like for our fee for service work, like a lot of people were really worried about engaging IndigenousX for services because of the optics of, like, we were for a long time, painted as very fringe, activisty, which, like, we're not afraid to do that sort of stuff, but that's not what the philosophy of IndigenousX is we'll have anyone. So, we did have a lot of people in that space, but we've had academics, we've had politicians, we've had anyone and everyone. So, that stuff, like when we did like the survey about Recognise, which sort of opened critical lens into Recognise, like we got drilled for that.
Yes.
And we paid a very high price for doing that. For those who don't know, so Recognise, when it kicked off for a long time, got very positive media, and there was no mainstream media that acknowledged that a lot of Indigenous people were very sus on Recognise as a thing. And so they brought out a survey saying like 87% of Indigenous people would vote yes if the referendum was tomorrow. And I was like, but we don't have a bloody question. Like we don't, and that's just not true of what I'm seeing online and in conversation and, within my own network. So like 87 is a very high number. To say that 87% of Indigenous people would sign their name on the bottom of a blank bit of paper that Tony Abbott will fill in later in our best interest. So I just, like, if they had come out and said 60%, I would have gone higher than I expected. All right. Like, 70%, like 87%, that's a very high number. So I paid $200 out of my own pocket for a SurveyMonkey subscription. And I tweeted out the link and I put it across Facebook and I sent it to all the pages. And we're very mindful of trying to be balanced because I knew that's not, self-selecting surveys and non-academic and whatever. So I sent it to Recognise and I sent it to all of everywhere. And we found inverse numbers, quite the opposite of what they'd published. And because we had the partnership with The Guardian, because no one cared about our survey, but we got Celeste Little to do the data analysis, then we got her to host IndigenousX that week. So she got the article in The Guardian saying, bullshit, we're calling you out. And then in The Guardian copped hell from that, from like people that might not know, but Peter Credlin had a very heavy hand over the Recognise campaign behind the scenes. So, Tony, Peter, then the Recognise campaign. And so they got calls from Peter, and then they rang me going, "Oh, wow, you were right." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm right. I told you that for a long time." But that sort of opened the door for other media to, because the problem with the Recognise campaign fundamentally was it went for too long. Like you don't get to have a blank space like that for 4 years. If they had just done that for 2 years and then done it, they probably would have, got what they were trying to do. But by 4 years, media was getting bored, and so that opened the door. But what happened then for the next couple of years after was, if you were an academic and doing a research project with PM&C, and you had on your application, "We're going to use IndigenousX for dissemination of research," you were told to remove that, or you would not get funded. So IndigenousX got blacklisted really aggressively from a lot of spaces. And so in those early days of transition into that being an obvious way for us to have made money, that completely just smashed us and set us back years. And we're only now really recovering from that.
I have 2 more questions that I want to push through in the last part of our conversation. We've talked about, the 2 questions we've talked about what next for IndigenousX and what a future, more sustainable landscape could look like, given that we appreciate its value, its disruptive value in mainstream media. My question is, what kind of effect or impact, if any, you might be looking to make on mainstream media's approach to Indigenous affairs? So do you have a sense of the future and about how you'd like mainstream media to be tackling Indigenous affairs? Or do you really, does it not matter as long as we have IndigenousX there doing its work?
Yeah, well, kind of in that sense of, like, what impact do I want it to have on our non-Indigenous audience? And it's like, you're not my problem, but at the same time, I realize that we do have influence on that audience, and I'd like it to be positive. So in that sense, like, I think, the simplest thing for what mainstream media can do is employ more Indigenous people and give them more autonomy. And not just in media, that's true of universities, and that's true of every bureaucracy and every institution and every industry.
Yes.
So actually recognize the value of having Indigenous people doing things differently and trying new things and giving people that freedom. And so, breaking down that idea of, like, that's not how it's done, or there's no audience for that, or there's no interest in that. And I think, again, not just IndigenousX, like we rose with that same tide of social media impacting on traditional media. And so IndigenousX, I like to think, had a big part of that, but it was just part of a shifting landscape more broadly.
Yeah.
And so a lot of other people, came into relevance and prevalent positions through their own blogs or through their own social media. And IndigenousX was just one of those that helped change that landscape. And so, I just want to keep doing what we're doing because I like doing what we do, and I don't ever want to work for anyone else ever again. But, like, I wanted, like, I'd love to move into podcasting. I'd love us to do more video content. I'd love to, have the opportunity to try new things for ourselves, because I think what we did when we did it, like I said, that landscape is shifting. And so I hope in some ways that, we provide something of a moral compass of calling out things when they're a bit dodgy, or challenging the status quo of thought around certain things. But like I don't want to try to predict our pathways or progression, but in terms of, the sustainability of IndigenousX, I've gotten to that point where I've completely given up on the idea that someone's going to make that easy for us.
Yeah.
And so we'll just run the business side of it, and we'll have the media side separate from that. And
figure it out.
But really, look, so we've got 1,200 Patreons, which out of 47,000 followers, that's a massive engagement rate. I don't know how far we can take that, but if that were to triple, we would be a very sustainable space just from Patreon. Then if we can get the ad stuff working out, and we could be a sustainable business in that. But I'm very comfortable with the idea of partially funding IndigenousX to complement the Patreon off the top of the consultancy. Yeah. So, and if we were just a plain consultancy with James and I, we would make more money than we're making because we're both on wages rather than just earning the money that we make through fee-for-service work. We've got ourselves on wages, and then anything else goes back into making sure that IndigenousX runs. And like I said, neither of us have dreams of building an empire or being overly wealthy out of this. We just want a comparable wage to what we could earn in comparable jobs.
Yeah.
But with the freedom to do what we want to do.
Good for you. I think the value of the service that IndigenousX provides and the value of the information and knowledge that it's able to disseminate nationally is more than deserving of that. My last question before I throw it open to everyone is in part informed by my own reflections and having had the privilege of hosting a couple of weeks ago where I had a few epiphanies because I don't really like Twitter. I didn't come to
There's
Twitter.
There's a lot not to like about Twitter, to be fair.
I didn't really come to Twitter with the kind of positive sense or enthusiasm that you described. I understand Twitter was a very different space 7 years ago.
It really was.
I would like your thoughts on what you think happens to Indigenous voices when they get to speak to Indigenous audiences instead of non-Indigenous audiences. What's your experience of that been? What have you seen of that through leading IndigenousX over the last 7 years?
Yeah, well, we often talk about like when people sort of step into that role, there is that moment of realization of like, oh, I can say the thing that I normally wouldn't say to white people in this space.
Even though the white people are there.
They're listening, but it's not for them. And that's something we've always, and some people still do, and some people are there because they want to talk to white people, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
But just to have a space that just says, like, you don't have to dumb it down, you don't have to ignore the elephant in the room, you can actually just say the things you want to say how you want to say them, and not to say that you won't cop some backlash for doing that. Like it's for a space the size we are, like it's amazing how little trolling we get. But that's not to say it doesn't happen or there's not backlash from other mob or from random people or from crazy trolls. But for most people, they do. They just really embrace and really sort of push themselves, and you see a lot of epiphany moments while people are hosting, and I really love that. And they get a bit of that validation. Like I like the fact that we're at that stage now where for a lot of hosts, just their very first tweet have gone like, "Hi," you'll get 500 likes and 20 people go, "Hi." That's just really cool. And it is like it's a really supportive audience with all things considered.
Yeah.
And we spent a lot of time in those early days of working with our non-Indigenous audience to understand their role.
Yes.
And that took a lot of work with a lot of people, really staunchly drawing that line in the sand, but people responded to it really well.
That it's interesting that you say that because I have only been on Twitter probably for 12 months, so I did not see that work being done. But I felt the effect of that work during my 1 week on it. And certainly while I've been following it over the last 12 months is that there is a really good, strong, there seems to be a very strong set of established protocols between how people order their relationships to one another between mob and across mobs, and certainly between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous audience.
Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful space. You kind of, people have been trying hard to like win me over to Twitter over the last couple of years. And yes, Sarah's like, yes. I'm like, no Twitter for me. But I have to say it was an exceptionally warm space to be online.
And it is, and to have a space that is, respected by mob, or even, like I said, a lot of people really don't like an individual who's hosting or don't like someone, but there is a broad consensus of respect for the importance of the space.
Yeah. And
that we need that space. And even though it has its ups and downs and some people just don't tweet, or you get someone who tweets stuff where I'm just like, makes me cringe seeing what some hosts tweet over there. But that's the point. That's what it's there for. We're not there to have everyone agree with every host. We're there to do the best we can. And when we say, we try to showcase the diversity of Indigenous experience, the realities of that are we showcase the diversity of Indigenous experience of people who are on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because we don't, we do our best to try and get people who aren't on Twitter to come in for a week, and that works well sometimes, sometimes it doesn't. But the reality is like Indigenous Twitter is very East Coast centric. So like we don't get as much territory, South Australia, even Tasmania, WA. So, we do make efforts above and beyond to try and get people on. But the reality is that, Indigenous Twitter is very East Coast centric. And we, roll with that. Like there are a whole range of limitations around what we can and can't do with IndigenousX, but we do the best we can with what we've got.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the richest contributions I think that I've witnessed across IndigenousX is its very capacity to hold those different views in place through the rotating host. I think that's what you get to achieve with a rotating host, is that the host gets to set the agenda and control the tone of the conversation in a way that we really don't get much capacity to do anywhere else. And then the next host gets to come on and do the same, whether they've agreed. That's what I mean, that there is not a continuity across hosting in that way. And what it does this really powerful thing to perform to Australia that we are not one mob and that we are not one set of ideas. And so it becomes a space both for those who, you do see people who use it to advocate their positions, but it also becomes a space that then just demonstrates how disagreement takes place across mob, but in a really respectful and informed way.
Yeah. I think that pen Indigenous, that I talk about the questions as the generic ask an Aborigine question that we've all got
as the expert for everything, right?
But just that anyone gets anywhere they go, the moment that they're visible, people go, and just these really generic, annoying, the sort of questions where you've got to explain what's wrong with the question. You know what I mean? Like you can't actually answer the question. You've got to go, here's what's wrong with asking me what's the Aboriginal word for.
So how much of a percentage are you Aboriginal?
All the things. But just a big part of the work with the audience was wait till that person says who they are and what they know and what they want to talk about, and then ask them about that. So like that is, and I mean, so much of the stuff that we've done that I think is really important is so freaking unambitious in the scheme of things. Like teaching people that we're not all one person is like the amount of people on Twitter who will talk to you as though you are all, like not just that you are generic and can speak on it, but that you are. Like, why do you mob do this? And it's like, I'm not 700,000 people. You must have confused me for the entire collective. But just that work is significant. And to get a space where you can actually have people you don't know interact with you as an individual, recognizing your individuality is pretty cool. Like I said, it shouldn't be. That should be fucking so common and normal. But it is. We still need that. And I'm stoked that just a random idea I had 7 years ago has become that sort of focal point for a lot of mob who come to Twitter. Like, and I've aggressively signed people up. I don't do it as much anymore, but it's like so many mob, like their first tweet is like, fucking, all right, Luke, I'm here. you got me. Or, they've seen me give a talk at somewhere like this, and their first tweet will be like, listening to Luke talk, want to check Twitter out for yourself. Yeah. And like that's really cool to have played that role, because I said Facebook's cool. Like, I'm on Facebook, just because everyone's on Facebook, but like people are on Twitter to have these different conversations and to challenge things and to speak, truth to power and to people. And it's really cool to be a part of that.
Well, thanks so much for doing it. What a genius idea. What a wonderful contribution to the state of public conversation in this country.